On a scorching day over New Guinea in 1944, a young man from rural Wisconsin closed to within 50 yards of a Japanese Zero before opening fire with his P-38 Lightning's 4 machine guns and single 20mm cannon. At that range, close enough to see the enemy pilot's face, close enough that debris from the disintegrating aircraft would strike his own plane. There was no possibility of missing, no chance for the target to evade, just the brutal certainty of concentrated firepower at point-blank range, turning an enemy aircraft into falling wreckage. This was how Major Richard Ira Bong fought, how he racked up 40 confirmed victories to become America's highest-scoring ace, and how he survived combat when conventional tactics said he should have been killed dozens of times. Bong's approach violated every principle taught in gunnery school. Get close. Get dangerously close. Close enough that you can't miss, but it worked for him with deadly consistency, while other pilots who followed textbook tactics struggled to hit anything at all. His aircraft, the twin-engine P-38 Lightning that he flew throughout his combat career and personalized with his wife's name Marge, painted on the nose, became inseparable from his legend. Together, Bong and his P-38 wrote one of the most remarkable combat records in aviation history, proving that in aerial combat, as in so much of war rules, were meant to be broken by those with the skill and nerve to do it right. Richard Bong was an unlikely candidate for aerial immortality. Born in 1920 in Superior, Wisconsin, he grew up on a dairy farm in the small community of Poplar, learning to work hard and fix machinery, but showing no particular signs of destined greatness. He was quiet, almost shy, with a gentle demeanor that would remain unchanged, even after he became the most deadly fighter pilot in American history. When he enrolled at Superior State Teachers College in 1938, he seemed headed for a career as a teacher or engineer. But Bong had developed a fascination with flying, taking advantage of the civilian pilot training program that was preparing young Americans for the war everyone could see coming. He soloed in 1941, discovered he had natural talent for flying, and immediately enlisted in the Army Air Corps, choosing fighters over bombers because, as he later explained with characteristic understatement, "I wanted to fly the fastest planes." The aircraft that would define Bong's career and become synonymous with his name was already controversial when he began training on it in 1942. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike any other American fighter, a twin-engine, twin-boom design that looked more like a small bomber than a conventional fighter. Each boom housed a 425-horsepower Allison engine, driving a counter-rotating propeller with the cockpit and armament mounted in a central nacelle between the booms. The configuration provided exceptional performance speeds, over 400 km/h soar ceiling, above 40,000 feet, and long range that would prove invaluable in the vast expanses of the Pacific. But it also created handling characteristics that many pilots found difficult. The heavy, twin-engine design meant the P-38 couldn't turn as tightly as single-engine fighters like the P-51 or Japanese Zero. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque issues, but created unique control responses. And the concentrated nose armament 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all firing straight ahead without the convergence issues of wing-mounted guns, required different gunnery techniques than pilots were taught in training. Most pilots struggled with the P-38, treating it as a liability, something to be endured rather than exploited. Bong immediately recognized its advantages. The twin engines provided redundancy. You could lose one engine and still make it home, a critical advantage over endless Pacific Ocean. The concentrated nose armament meant that if you aimed the aircraft at a target and fired, every gun hit the same point, creating devastating effect without requiring complex calculations of convergence angles. The heavy firepower and long range made it ideal for the bomber escort and long-range patrol missions that dominated Pacific air operations. And while the P-38 couldn't turn fight with Zeros, it was faster in a dive and in level flight, meaning an experienced pilot could control the engagement, attacking when advantageous and breaking off when threatened. Bong arrived in the Southwest Pacific Theater in September 1942, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group based in New Guinea. He was 22 years old, newly married to Marjorie Vattendahl, the woman whose name would soon adorn his aircraft, and completely inexperienced in combat. His first missions were uneventful patrols over the jungle, learning the terrain, the weather patterns, and the operational procedures that kept pilots alive in an environment as deadly as any enemy. New Guinea was hell for aviators' mountainous terrain that created unpredictable weather, thick jungle that meant any forced landing would likely be fatal, no reliable navigation aids, and Japanese forces that held most of the island and operated from hidden airfields scattered throughout the jungle. Bong's first kill came on December 27, 1942, during a patrol over Buna. His flight encountered Japanese fighters, probably Zeros or Ki-43 Oscars, though. Identification at combat speeds was always uncertain, and Bong maneuvered into position behind one enemy aircraft. Instead of opening fire at the 300 to 400 yard range that gunnery school taught Bong, closed to less than 100 yards, waited until he couldn't possibly miss, and then hammered the enemy with concentrated fire that destroyed the aircraft almost instantly. The kill was confirmed by his wingman, and Bong returned to base having learned the most important lesson of his combat career: getting close worked. Over the following months, Bong developed and refined the tactics that would make him legendary. His approach was deceptively simple. Use the P-38's speed and altitude advantage to position above and behind enemy aircraft dive, to build speed close to point-blank range, typically 50 to 100 yards, sometimes as close as 25 yards, and then fire a short, concentrated burst. The extreme close range meant that even brief firing 1 or 2 seconds put dozens of 50 caliber rounds and 20mm shells into a small area, typically the enemy's cockpit engine or fuel tanks. Aircraft hit at this range didn't just get damaged, they exploded, disintegrated, or went immediately out of control with the pilot killed or incapacitated. The danger of this approach was obvious and terrified other pilots who watched Bong operate. At 50 yards, you were in the debris field when the enemy aircraft exploded or broke up. Pieces of wing canopy engine parts, even fuel, could strike your own aircraft, causing damage or starting fires. The closing speed was so high that overshooting the target was a constant risk. If you didn't start pulling out immediately after firing, you could collide with the target or fly through its debris. An enemy aircraft at close range could maneuver unpredictably, meaning that what seemed like a perfect shot could turn into a collision if the target suddenly rolled or pulled up. Every one of Bong's attacks required split-second timing, perfect distance judgment, and nerves that allowed him to hold his fire until the last possible moment when every instinct screamed to shoot from safer range or break off the attack. But the tactics worked consistently because Bong had gifts that couldn't be taught. His distance judgment was exceptional. He could gauge range to within yards at combat speeds, knowing exactly when he'd reach the optimal firing position. His deflection shooting was excellent, allowing him to hit maneuvering targets even at close range. His aircraft handling was smooth and precise, keeping his gun sight on target during the brief moments when he was firing. And perhaps most importantly, his situational awareness was extraordinary. Bong seemed to always know where enemy aircraft were, where his wingmen were, where threats might come from, and when to attack versus when to break off and reposition. Combat film from his gun cameras shows him tracking targets, smoothly firing precisely and breaking away immediately after the kill, always in control, even in the chaos of dogfights. The P-38 he flew became as famous as the man himself. Bong's assigned aircraft varied throughout his combat tours. He flew multiple P-38s as aircraft were damaged, transferred or upgraded, but all of them carried the name Marge painted on the nose, along with the nose art of a scantily clad woman that was standard for the era. The name was Bong's tribute to his wife Marjorie, whom he had married just before deploying overseas and who represented everything he was fighting to protect and return home to. The aircraft became personalized in ways beyond just the name. Bong knew every quirk of his P-38s, how they handled where they were slightly out of trim, what sounds meant trouble versus normal operation. He maintained close relationships with his ground crew, understanding that his survival depended on their work as much as his skill. As Bong's score mounted through 1943 and into 1944, his reputation grew and complicated his combat operations. By mid-1943, he had become the leading American ace in the Pacific theater, and his commanding officers faced a dilemma. Aces were valuable for morale and propaganda. The public needed heroes, and a farm boy from Wisconsin shooting down Japanese aircraft was perfect for that role. But aces were also valuable as combat pilots, and losing Bong to enemy fire would be a propaganda disaster. The army began pulling Bong out of regular combat rotation for public relations appearances, war bond tours, and meetings with dignitaries. Bong hated this feeling that he belonged with his squadron, but orders were orders. He would complete a tour of duty, be sent back to the United States for rest and publicity duties, and then argue his way back to the Pacific for another combat tour. His tactics evolved as the war progressed, and as Japanese aircraft and pilots changed. Early in his combat career, Bong often encountered experienced Japanese pilots flying superior aircraft like the Zero, which could outturn the P-38 and required careful tactical discipline to defeat. By 1944, Japanese pilot quality was declining dramatically as experienced aviators were killed and replacements arrived with minimal training. Bong found himself fighting Japanese pilots who made fundamental mistakes flying straight and level, failing to check their tails, not using basic defensive maneuvers. The kills became easier, less about brilliant tactics and more about mechanical execution. Find the enemy position for attack, close to point-blank range, fire, confirm the kill, look for the next target. But even against inferior opposition, Bong never became complacent. He understood that the Japanese pilot who killed you might be an inexperienced rookie who made a lucky shot, or who panicked and collided with your aircraft. Every mission carried risk, and Bong's survival to 40 kills was as much about what he didn't do as what he did. He refused to pursue enemy aircraft into clouds where visibility was zero and collision was likely. He broke off attacks if his situational awareness was compromised or if he'd lost track of enemy positions. He never let victory fever convince him to chase damaged aircraft into dangerous situations. And he respected the capabilities of Japanese aircraft and pilots, even when their overall quality declined, knowing that underestimating the enemy was how good pilots died. The relationship between Bong and his P-38 was symbiotic and personal in ways that pilots of other aircraft types rarely experienced. The twin-engine configuration meant the P-38 was roomy by fighter standards, with space for personal items, better visibility than most single-engine fighters, and systems that were more forgiving of battle damage. Bong could bring his damaged P-38 home on one engine after combat that would have forced other pilots to bail out. The heavy armament meant he didn't need many hits to destroy targets. A brief burst at close range was devastating, and the aircraft's performance characteristics matched his tactical approach fast enough to dictate engagement terms stable enough for precise gunnery, rugged enough to absorb battle damage and bring him home. By December 1944, Bong had achieved 40 confirmed kills, breaking Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record and becoming America's all-time leading ace. The Army decided his combat career was over. He was too valuable as a symbol to risk losing in combat, and 40 kills was a round number that made for good headlines. Bong was ordered home, promoted to major, and assigned to test pilot duties, theoretically safe duty, evaluating new aircraft rather than fighting the war. He married Marjorie in a ceremony that received national press coverage. The war hero and his sweetheart, whose name he'd carried into combat, finally together permanently. He seemed to have survived the war, beaten the odds that killed so many other fighter pilots, and earned the right to a peaceful future. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, Richard Bong was killed in the crash of a Lockheed P-80 shooting star jet fighter he was testing at Burbank, California. The aircraft suffered engine failure on takeoff, and Bong attempted to bail out, but was too low for his parachute to deploy fully. He was 24 years old. The irony was bitter and obvious. He had survived over 200 combat missions, 40 aerial victories, countless moments when Japanese bullets and shells could have killed him, only to die in a training accident flying a prototype jet in California. The nation that had celebrated him as a hero mourned his death. But the manner of it dying in an aircraft accident rather than in combat seemed particularly cruel to those who knew him. The P-38 Lightning that Bong had flown to fame continued in service through the end of the war and was gradually phased out as jet aircraft made piston-engine fighters obsolete. The specific P-38s that Bong flew were mostly lost to accident combat damage or routine disposal. The military didn't yet have a strong tradition of preserving historically significant aircraft, and Bong's P-38s were seen as just more fighters to be used and discarded as needed. This loss is tragic for aviation historians, who would love to examine the actual aircraft that America's top ace flew, to understand how he maintained and modified them to preserve them as tangible connections to his achievement. Bong's legacy in American military aviation is substantial but often overlooked. He became the standard against which all other American fighter pilots were measured, achieving more kills than Bong became impossible after his death, since no pilot came close to his total in Korea or Vietnam, where aerial combat was less frequent. His 40 victories remained the American record, and will almost certainly remain so forever given the nature of modern air warfare where aerial dogfights are increasingly rare. But beyond the numbers, Bong represented an approach to combat that emphasized closing with the enemy, accepting risk to ensure kills, and using your aircraft's advantages rather than complaining about its disadvantages. The tactical lessons of Bong's career remain relevant. His principle of getting extremely close before firing, violating every conventional doctrine about maintaining safe distances, proved that gunnery effectiveness at close range outweighed the risks of debris and collision. His understanding that the P-38's advantages, speed, firepower, twin engines, more than compensated for its disadvantages. Poor turning performance showed the importance of flying to your aircraft's strengths rather than trying to match enemy strengths. His survival through 200-plus missions demonstrated that aggressive tactics didn't mean reckless tactics, that you could be deadly effective while still exercising judgment and discipline about when to attack and when to break off. The personalization of his aircraft with Marge represented something deeper than just decoration. It was a reminder that even in the mechanical, technical world of aerial combat, human connections mattered. Bong was fighting for something specific: his wife, his family, his home. Not just abstract concepts like victory or duty. The name on his aircraft kept that concrete reality present, even in the midst of combat, grounding his warrior identity in his civilian identity as a husband and son. After his death, Marjorie Bong remarried and lived a long life, but she never forgot the young pilot who had carried her name into combat and who had become America's greatest ace. The debate about whether Bong was truly the greatest American fighter pilot is probably unanswerable. His 40 kills led all Americans, but other pilots had different missions, flew different aircraft, or operated in theaters where opportunities for aerial combat were more limited. Some pilots with fewer kills might have been more skilled in certain aspects of flying or fighting. What's undeniable is that Bong was extraordinarily effective at the specific mission of shooting down enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, that he developed tactics that worked consistently for him, even if they terrified observers, and that he survived long enough to prove that aggressive close-range fighting could work when executed with skill and judgment. The P-38 Lightning's reputation was shaped significantly by Bong's success. The aircraft had critics who found it difficult to fly or who didn't appreciate its capabilities. But Bong's achievements demonstrated what the Lightning could do in the hands of a pilot who understood and exploited its strengths. Later assessments of the P-38's effectiveness in the Pacific theater invariably reference Bong as proof that the design worked, that its twin-engine configuration and heavy armament made it ideal for Pacific operations, despite its limitations in turning combat. The aircraft and the pilot became inseparable in public imagination. Bong flew P-38s throughout his career. The P-38 was associated with his victories, and together they represented American air power at its most effective. When evaluating Richard Bong's career, It's important to remember both what he achieved and what he represented. He achieved 40 confirmed kills against enemy aircraft, a record that stands unchallenged. He survived over 200 combat missions in an era when the average fighter pilot's life expectancy was measured in weeks. He developed and proved tactics that violated conventional wisdom, but that worked with devastating consistency. And he did all of this with a quiet, humble demeanor that made him seem more like the Wisconsin farm boy he'd been than the deadly combat pilot he'd become. He never bragged, never claimed to be special, never treated his achievements as anything but doing the job he'd been assigned as well as he knew how. But he also represented something larger, the idea that ordinary Americans from ordinary backgrounds could become exceptional when circumstances demanded it. Bong wasn't a natural warrior or someone who seemed destined for military glory. He was a farm kid who happened to be good at flying and who developed through experience and natural talent into someone who could consistently outfight enemy pilots in an environment where skill gaps meant the difference between life and death. His story was proof that American pilots could match or exceed anyone in the world, that the industrial might that produced aircraft like the P-38 could be matched by individual skill and courage that made those aircraft devastatingly effective. The manner of Bong's death killed testing a jet fighter in California rather than dying in combat over the Pacific adds a tragic coda to his story. He had beaten the odds, survived the war's most dangerous role, and earned the right to a peaceful future. That he died anyway, killed by mechanical failure in a prototype jet, seems cruelly ironic. But it also reflects the reality that aviation in that era was inherently dangerous, that test pilots accepted risks comparable to combat pilots, and that the transition from piston engines to jets was achieved through the efforts and sometimes the deaths of pilots who tested aircraft that weren't yet perfected. Bong died doing his duty just as he would have if he'd been shot down over New Guinea, and that was perhaps fitting for someone who never sought glory but simply did what was asked of him with quiet excellence. The image of Richard Bong closing to 50 yards before firing of Marge, painted on his P-38's nose of the quiet Wisconsin farm boy who became America's deadliest fighter pilot. These have become permanent parts of American military mythology. They represent both historical reality and something larger proof that in aerial combat, as in so much of warfare, the personal qualities of courage, skill and judgment matter as much as technology and numbers. Bong and his P-38 Lightning showed what was possible when an exceptional pilot flew an underappreciated aircraft with tactics that shouldn't have worked, but that proved devastatingly effective when executed with precision and nerve. That legacy endures, making Richard Ira Bong not just America's top ace by numbers, but one of the defining figures in the history of military aviation.